Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell leads awake fire and slaughter. Spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, sword day, red day, ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride now, ride to Gondor!
This quote is taken from The Lord of the Rings, Chapter 5 of the first book of The Return of the King, when Theoden calls out to his men, espousing a great, if short, variant of a poem taken from the Poetic Edda, altered by Professor Tolkien. In many ways, it is the high point of a grand age of literature, and of perhaps the grandest of all genres. No other genre in the modern age has filled people with more longing, wistfulness, despair, hope, and love, and countless other emotions than this one genre. It is a grander genre, to be sure, with higher stakes and infinitely more depth than any other. It is a genre that reflects the nature of life, the tragedies of history, hope for the future, despair at what has been lost, and yet that has always succeeded in giving men and women of all ages the finest of examples to strive towards, to aspire to, and to relate to in some cases. It is a flawless genre in some ways. A genre that harkens back to an age undreamed of. An age of glory, of war, of valor, of honor, barbarism, and most of all, heroism. A genre that has always spoken to the very heart of what it means to be human. It is a genre with the finest of villains, the most devious and cruel of tyrants, the most disappointing of figures, and yet the most inspiring tales of redemption, hope, and goodness. And it all began with the Mythic, or Golden Age of Fantasy. It was a time of myth-making, when writers such as Lord Dunsany, Robert Irwin Howard, Walter Disney, and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien flourished, living about the same time as one another, and creating mythologies and stories cut in the mold of the likes of the Norse sagas, Greek tragedies, medieval tales, and epics of old. They all achieved greatness in their own way. None of them knew it though, but they were in effect planting the seeds for a future genre that was to grow and flourish and become greater than any other in the West. The first of these men to try his hand did so with the goal of creating rather more folkloric fairy stories that are different from those of Howard and Tolkien, as they are from those that followed after them, where the other two created national epics for Texas and England respectively. Dunsany wrote stories that seemed to have more in common, at first glance, with those of the brothers Grimm and Perrault. That said, his stories belong no less to the realm of myth-making than those of his two major successors. Born in the year 1876, on July 24th, and passing away in 1957 on October 25th, he was to be influenced by the very fairy tale writers of whom I made reference, along with others. He was the first to undertake the noble and unusual literary work of pioneering the new genre over the course of a long and very respectable career. His story of The Sword of Welleran, King of Elfland's Daughter, and many others remain popular to this very day, and though I've yet to read them, I will, never fear. I've heard nothing but good things about them. The next great myth maker needs no introduction, as in many ways, the story of the genre is the story of his greatest character, Conan, the Cimmerian. Conan, though, was not created in a vacuum. An expert on anthropology, Robert E. Howard was born in the year 1906, and was thus writing in the prime of his youth by the 1920s and 30s. His first jab at creating myth was the legendary Kull the King, or Kull of Atlantis, or Kull of the Thurian Age. Dissatisfied with the character after writing him for some time, Howard cast the Atlantean aside in order to create a number of other characters, but none more marked or important as Conan. Conan stole the hearts of many, and it was he who starred in the first great mythological national epic in several centuries. The Hour of the Dragon was arguably the finest novel of the 1930s. Finer than The Hobbit, and greater than any other volume produced in the 30s. In the popular imagination, it has mostly been wiped away, and yet it stands tall as the only book that merits being placed in the same league as Lord of the Rings. It was not that Auer was a Lord of the Rings slayer, but rather that the Lord of the Rings was the Hour of the Dragon Slayer. The book, though not an initial success, was to be re-released several times in the decades that followed, and was to grow ever more successful over the course of these decades. It is not of Howard, though, that most think of when they call back to the Golden Age, or rather, to Tolkien. The good professor was author, as all know, of The Hobbit in 1937, then spent the 40s working tirelessly upon his epic novel, Lord of the Rings, one with the exact same plot as Hour of the Dragon, with a few details changed, and minus Conan. This in spite of the fact that Tolkien had never read The Hour of the Dragon. Lord of the Rings was the true harbinger of a new genre, spawning countless imitators and copycats, some good, others bad. That said, Lord of the Rings was arguably not Tolkien's magnum opus, but the Silmarillion was, easily the most finely written and edited work of the 20th century, published posthumously by the good professor's son, Christopher, who continued to search his father's archives for more writings in order to publish even more novel epics of the mythic age of fantasy literature. There simply aren't enough words in the English dictionary or any other language known to man to praise Tolkien enough for his great epic, or his son for having dedicated his life to his father's great works. Cinematically, the Mythic Age could also be called the Age of Walt, for it was during this era that Walt Disney, that great enterprising hero of American history and animation filmmaking, hero to my own mentor, Don Bluth, created his magnificent and flawless masterpieces, Snow White, Bambi, and Cinderella. Born in 1901, Walter Disney was to suffer failure after World War I in his attempts to break even with his animation. Arguably, it was his magnum opus and greatest commercial success that bankrolled him to well-deserved success, at long last, Snow White. Afterwards, he made movies such as Fantasia, a masterpiece of a film incomparable in its glorification of music. Walt then went on to create many a Disney shorts, each one charming and gloriously made, followed by Dumbo and Bambi, the latter which holds a special place in my heart. But to traditional fantasy, Walt added another great gemstone to his magnificent imperial crown, Cinderella, a masterpiece which cannot be recommended enough, and that still resonates to this very day. It must be stated that Walt's stories feel rather more targeted to girls, where Howard's, for example, are more for boys. This is natural. And yet, there's a timelessness to Walt's tales, a love and a faith that even boys could appreciate, and have across multiple generations. Walt and his brother Ron, who helped to forge the Disney Corporation, were less concerned with creating a grand sweeping legendarium all tied in together, and more interested, it seemed, in creating a cinematic series of fairy tales. His stories were grand, the art used in them incredible, and his vision awe-inspiring. Frankly speaking, in my view, only Don has surpassed him in these qualities, but on that front, I'm biased. But in the tapestry of the history of fantasy, Walt merits his place as a forebearer of the genre, alongside Dunsany, Howard, and Tolkien. But alas, in time, Walt stepped away from supervising animation himself to focus on other aspects of his business. This was natural, and he had other dreams, with the 9 old men of Disney coming in to supervise, rather more than him, the production of future animated Disney films. Walt Disney was to pass away in 1966, having given more to the genre than one can imagine, and having done so with earnest love and passion for animation, film, and children, instilling in them the knowledge that they could dream, they could hope for much more than life would have them dream of and do with their lives. The Mythic Age was not to last, as you all know, for though Lord of the Rings was published in the early to mid-1950s, the Silver Age began just as the Golden was coming to a close, so that there's a brief overlap between them. Though much of Tolkien's work was published posthumously, it belongs to the era prior to the Silver Age, due entirely to his having written most of it before, and to his continuing to write in the mode of the Golden Age, an age that used more Victorian English, used medieval literary devices, and followed in those traditions and tropes, rather more than any modern ones. It was an age of experimentation, development, and birth, unlike any other for any other genre. For within the fantasy genre, thanks to Tolkien and even Howard, it was to comprise within it all other genres, saving perhaps sci-fi. What started the next age, you may ask? Arguably, it was Lewis, the great friend of Tolkien. He was really the one who jump-started with his highly allegorical first tale of Narnia. This was the herald of what fantasy would morph into, and began the process of metamorphosing it from something more medieval and Victorian into something rather more modern. This in spite of Lewis himself hardly being all that fond of modernity, with the Silver Age beginning rather inauspiciously, yet managing to leave its indelible mark upon the genre, so that there's very little of the mythic left, as writers preferred to imitate Lewis and his heirs rather than Tolkien and Howard directly. A grave error in literary history, if I may say so. This is but the first in the history of fantasy series, and if you have enjoyed it thus far, do remember to smash that like button and to subscribe, and also to comment. But not only to this channel, but also to those of the brothers Arda and brothers Hiborian, if you like Tolkien and Howard respectively, as they are rather more focused channels where those two figures are concerned.